Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the What is Money show. I am thrilled today to be sitting down with Mr. Pierre Poilievre, Member of Parliament, Canadian Parliament, representing a district in Ottawa. Pierre, it's been a long time coming. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be on the show. I've enjoyed your show. I find it extremely informative, and my wife and I have been known to watch YouTube in your channel late into the night once we got the kids out, and so we've always enjoyed it. And I've learned a lot about Bitcoin and other monetary issues from listening to you. So I'm glad to finally make your virtual acquaintance. I hope we can do it in person at some point.
Yeah, it's great to have you, and I'm really thrilled to hear you guys have been getting a lot of value out of the show. And likewise to you, you really made a splash in the Bitcoin Twitter universe when you went on a rant about what is money on the floor of Parliament.
Yeah, well, listen, and it was funny because it was around that time I think you were reaching out, and then I realized your show is actually called "What Is Money." I'd watched another show of yours, but basically the speech said a lot of the same things that you're saying, which is that money is a means of transporting value between people and across space and time. And sometimes, asking a first principles question like that in the House of Commons turns a lot of heads, because so often parliamentary debates are mixed up either in the minutia of a highly technical bill or in a bunch of partisan talking points that are incredibly boring and bake in a whole bunch of faulty assumptions from the beginning. And if someone stands up and says, "What is money?" everyone says, "Oh, wait a sec here, I hadn't thought of that." And I think half of Parliament wouldn't have been able to answer the question, even though they walk around with it in their pockets every day.
Well, I think it's a great deed for you to be asking that question in that space. I think it is one of the most underappreciated questions in the world, when people, even like Ray Dalio, don't necessarily appreciate all the aspects of money, a guy that by all appearances has made it in every way. I think it's very important that we ask these foundational questions specifically in our forums of leadership, because how can we lead if we don't understand the foundations of things? So thank you for that. Thank you for taking that discussion.
I think you're right about that. And in politics, the most frustrating part, Robert, is that when politicians spend money, they often have no consideration for where it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a parliamentary committee a while back, and the government was proposing another $7 billion expenditure, and I simply said, "Where's the money coming from?" There were about 9 senior public servants in our finance department who sat there dead silent for about 5 minutes. And not a single one of them could explain where they were getting the money to fund the program. And they have all kinds of technical explanations about how the tax system was going to deliver the money, and how what department was going to engineer it, and which public servants would be involved in spending it, and who would be receiving it. But none of them had even stopped for a second to consider that the money had come from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And my poor little daughter is crying up there right now because she's paying the debt that the government is amassing with all of this spending. But they literally, Robert, it's amazing. They literally don't even consider where money comes from. They act as though it is just theirs. And how can you perform a cost-benefit analysis if you don't actually consider who pays the cost?
Right.
And of course, most recently, people have been paying it not just through their taxes, but through their inflation.
Okay, so given that definition of money, and clearly I agree with you that it's a foundational technology to civilization. Like, we can't scale human cooperation without it. It's very important. But to your point, politicians discussing how to spend money, you said they're not doing cost benefit calculation. Maybe they are actually, because the cost is effectively zero.
To them.
To them,
To
exactly,
them.
which leads to misallocation of capital, frivolous spending, etc. So, what, in your view, is the proper role of government in the sphere of money?
Well, I will answer that question directly. I just wanted to quote quickly one of my favorite economists, Thomas Sowell,
Mm.
who said the first rule of economics is scarcity. There's always more demand than there is supply.
Mm-hmm.
People always want more than what there is to offer. And the first rule of politics is to ignore the first rule of economics. Now, why is it that politicians can ignore the scarcity that is imposed on every single creature on Earth? Every creature on Earth lives with scarcity, whether it's a tiny microbe, whether it is a plant that is competing for soil and sun and carbon dioxide, whether it is a creature in the forest fighting for food. Every single creature on the earth, except the politician, must live with scarcity. Why? Because the politician has the ability to pass on that scarcity to someone else. And so he believes that he has an infinite supply of resources to expend. And even if he expends them badly, it is of no cost to him. And that's how we end up with this problem. And so you mentioned, what is the government's role in the issue of money? Well, this is something I had to stumble on after years of frustration watching governments overspend. See, I always said to myself, well, overspending will be unpopular because politicians will end up passing it on in higher taxes, and no one likes taxes. So, but what I found was that they, instead of raising taxes, which would be bad, they did something, they raised them indirectly by creating cash and imposing an inflation tax. And what is surreptitious about an inflation tax is that nobody realizes why they're paying the higher cost. So as more dollars flood the economy and raise the price of consumer goods, people blame their grocer for the higher food prices, the realtor for the higher house prices, the gas station for the higher gas prices. Not knowing that it's actually the politician that has inflated the cost of all of those things. And so what I think politicians, and we need to depoliticize the central banks, and they need to have a single purpose, which is to protect the value of our money by fighting inflation. And in my view is that the lower the inflation, the better. I don't believe that provoking inflation stimulates economic growth. To the contrary, I think it actually shrinks the economy, the real economy of goods and services, by screwing up price signals and by punishing good economic behavior. And so the role of central banks in money, I believe, should be singularly to protect its value and keep inflation low.
Amen to that. So would you say then that 0% would be like the ideal inflation rate? The lower, the better?
Well, I think that would be an ideal. There's no question that zero inflation would mean that people would not be paying higher prices for their goods, and their dollars would retain their their value. That would be the ideal. It's not possible for any central bank to hit that target every year. But for example, Switzerland has a target of less than 2%, unlike the Americans who say 1 to 3. The Swiss say under 2. And as a result, their inflation has been about 1% for the last 25 years. And the consequence of that is that the Swiss continually have increasing purchasing power. They did not suffer the same crash in the 2008 crisis that afflicted much of Europe and the United States. Why? Because they hadn't inflated asset bubbles, right? That went on to burst in the U.S. and in Ireland and Spain and Portugal, etc. Their assets were properly priced, and as a result of their strong franc, they are. As a result of their strong currency, they are able to effectively outpurchase international consumers for globally priced goods like oil and agricultural produce and others. And they have very low inflation now, even in the middle of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yes, excellent points. And your point's well taken that the blame sort of gets mitigated, right? When prices are rising, presumably government gets at least plausible deniability to blame the greed of the gas station or whatever merchant instead of the actual problem, which is monetary debasement.
Yes, exactly. It's a sneaky tax, and it is. I argue it's almost an illegal tax because in our parliamentary system, which the Americans have more or less have adopted in a certain way, you cannot tax what the people have not approved in our British parliamentary model, and you have that in the States, right? Every tax has to go through Congress. So what inflation does is it allows presidents, prime ministers, kings, dictators, etc., to basically break that 800-year convention that goes back to the Magna Carta of 1215. And I have argued that our bank in Canada has broken its own law with the by holding more vastly more debt than its than the statute allows it to. So I really think that it's a deliberate debasement of currency, and imposition of inflation is an illegal form of tax, and it should be called out as such.
I agree with it wholeheartedly. We've called it taxation without legislation.
Yes,
I think it's pretty spot on. So,
absolutely.
In what I think is a related topic here, you're somewhat of a known advocate for individual responsibility, which is something I think is very important as well. And I think, at least in Western civilization, we use property rights, frankly, to incentivize individual responsibility. Yet fiat currency, as we've discussed, it's being used as this surreptitious mechanism for violating property rights via inflation. So what impact do you think inflation is having on individual responsibility itself? Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin.
It separates a number of elements of life that are meant to go together. So, for example, work is meant to go with a reward. Money is the way of transporting today's work into tomorrow's reward. So if in transporting that money, it's losing value, then we're delinking our labor from its reward. It'd be like, having a bucket. You go down to the river and fill it with water, but it's leaking. So by the time you actually get back to your house, it's half empty. Well, all the work that you did to go get it, or half of the work you did is actually canceled out. And second, it removes the relationship between risk and reward. A lot of very wealthy people get much wealthier without taking any serious risk simply by owning assets that inflate in value. And then finally, it rewards instant gratification. If dollar, and it punishes delayed gratification. We want to encourage people to have delayed gratification, to be responsible and say, I'm going to put off the pleasure of the moment in order to have a greater reward down the road by building up a surplus through my labor. Well, if that surplus is constantly evaporating by inflation, then your incentive is to instantly spend it. So Milton Friedman, the classical economist, he said, he was asked once in a public forum, what should I do with my money in times of inflation? And he said, spend it. Just spend it all. Because he said, now, I don't think it's good that you have to spend it all. But it is the reality that if you don't spend it now, it will be worth less later on. So the rational person in times of inflation has to go out and just buy as much stuff as possible before it becomes more expensive. It's like in the Weimar Republic, you'd go to the bar and you'd order all 10 beer at the beginning of the night, because as the night went on, they got more and more expensive. Well, that's an extreme example. But if you didn't order those 10 beer at the start, you'd end up paying more. You'd be punished for your patience. And we want to encourage people to be responsible, to defer their pleasures in order to have a bigger reward greater later on. But inflation discourages that. It punishes savers and rewards spenders. And as a result, we get more spending, less saving, and we're constantly up to our eyeballs in debt and on the verge of these repeating debt crises that seem to strike our economies once every 15 to 20 years.
Brilliantly said. And yeah, it's ultimately disincentivizing us to accumulate capital, instead incentivizing us to consume capital, which is detrimental to civilization itself. Like, the more capital we have, the more rich we are, the higher standard of living, et cetera.
Yes, so, absolutely.
Completely agree with that. I want to read a quote here from Ayn Rand and then ask you a question. She wrote that the right to life is the source of all rights, and the right to property is their only implementation. Without property rights, no other rights are possible. Since man has to sustain his life by his own effort, the man who has no right to the product of his effort has no means to sustain life, unquote. So my question is, if we have then the violation of property rights via inflation, and property is the basis of all other human rights or civil liberties, whatever we want to call them, isn't inflation sort of destroying like the foundation itself of Western civilization? And if so, isn't there some moral or economic imperative here that we really do something about it?
Well, inflation has destroyed civilizations in the past. It has definitely taken down, historically, I'm talking, particularly in the medieval period and going back further into ancient history, you can find examples of regimes that were brought down in part because of inflation. I would argue that one of the things that brought down Henry VIII was actually the Great Debasement, where he basically he melted down the British pound and filled it with copper so that he could make more coins with the same amount of silver. And that was one of the reasons why and of course, there was runaway inflation of about 80% over 5 years in price increases for his population. This is one of the reasons why he was such a horribly unpopular king by the time he left. And if you look at a lot of countries that consistently have runaway inflation, they're absolutely unstable. They're they're constantly in political upheaval. So we haven't had inflation to the point where it's destabilizing outside of the 1970s in the post-war period. It has just been gradually chipping away at the value of our money and the worth of our work. But I do believe it is bad in a lot of ways. It breaks down the most powerful form of economic communication, which is the price signal. Friedman also said, I hope you don't mind me quoting Friedman. I know you're more of an Austrian guy.
I still like Friedman.
Right. He had a lot of great things to say. And one of them is he talks about how complicated it is to make a pencil. And he said, look, there are people in a lead mine, perhaps in Asia. There's someone in a rubber factory in the Midwest United States creating the eraser. There's somebody in a titanium mine producing the the raw materials for the yellow paint. There's someone cutting down a tree in a forest in order to supply the lumber for the little pencil. And then there's some factory where it's all put together. And all these people are out there making a pencil. None of them really know they're making a pencil. I mean, they're just showing up for work because the wages signal to them that it's worth their time. It's the most optimal use of their day. And those who are transporting those raw materials, they don't know that it's going to become a pencil, but they're transporting it because the price signal is telling them that it is wanted. And then the consumer walks into the store and sees this pencil, and all the information about all those thousands of people who help make the pencil is embedded in a little 3-digit price.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it costs for a pencil these days, but say a box of pencils is, $4.99. You're basically seeing all of that work that has gone into that, creating that box of pencils is communicated to you in a 3-digit price signal. If inflation, though, is like taking the antenna on those old televisions that we had growing up and shaking it around, and then the screen gets fuzzy and you can't hear your program anymore, it totally messes up the relations between buyers and sellers, borrowers and lenders, taxpayers and governments, wage earners and employers, because the language with which they're communicating the price is completely out of whack. And so it can lead to a major economic and interpersonal breakdown in a way that people don't really appreciate when they see the statistical report of the inflation number every month.
Yeah, excellent points there. And that essay that he's referring to, Pencil, it's one of the best essays I've ever read. And it's exactly what you're describing. And yeah, it's how humans cooperate and interact at scale. If you distort that medium, then our action is thrown into disarray and disharmony. So,
right, absolutely,
it's a great point. So you've also been outspoken on the impact of inflation on the housing market, which I think is something that's been disproportionately impacting Canada, it seems, or at least certain regions in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've also thought about this and written about this somewhat, that housing price inflation is a contributor to homelessness, right? As people are getting basically priced out of the housing market by others that are seeking refuge from inflation, which it's a very kind of a perverse situation. So how big of an issue is housing price inflation in Canada today? And, what do you think should be done about that?
Well, it's the biggest single economic issue coming out of COVID in Canada. One analyst has said that the housing is effectively cannibalizing the Canadian economy. You can see that as housing has taken an increasingly large share of Canada's GDP, the amount we are spending on research and development and business development has declined. So instead of our money going into capital, that produces things in factories and software and railroads and other economic infrastructure, that's going like this, and house prices are going like this. Now, why is that? Well, the answer is people can get a return on investment simply owning a static house that sits there on the ground and doesn't move, because the central banks are pumping so much easy money into the housing market that it is inflating at an exceptional pace. The last 6 years, we've had 85% total housing inflation. In the last year, 26% alone. We now have the second most inflated housing bubble in the world, according to Bloomberg. And according to Demographia, Vancouver and Toronto are the second and fifth most expensive housing markets on earth, which is crazy, because what do we have in Canada? Lots of land. We're the second biggest nation on earth. We've got more places where there's no one than we have places where there's anyone. If you spread Canadians out evenly, they'd have 33 NFL football fields to themselves, each person.
Wow.
We have a bigger landmass than the US with 1/10 the population, and yet our real estate is vastly more expensive. Now, that's partly because local socialist politicians block construction, but the other part is this easy money. So right now in Canada, you can get a variable rate mortgage for 1.5%. And inflation is the official rate, if you believe that, is 4.8%. So just even if you believe the official government numbers, you now have an interest rate on mortgages that is 3.3% lower than inflation. So it's negative real rates of 3.3%. We're literally paying people to borrow big dollars and buy houses that they can't afford with variable rates that could go up without notice and increase their payments. And this is fundamentally a monetary phenomenon. And Robert, I'd be happy to give you the graphs. The housing prices were about to correct. They started correcting going into COVID. QE starts, bam, in late March 2020. All of a sudden, April, prices start shooting straight up. So we're coming into a correction that was long overdue already. The central bank says we're going to shovel $400 billion into the Canadian financial system, and all of a sudden prices start going through the roof. We know what is happening. The central bank is inflating housing prices and leading to a very serious risk that we'll have a crash down the road.
Yeah, it's truly a disaster, and I'm glad you're speaking out about that. Let's talk about something else that's been really big in Canada recently, which is, and I hope I'm calling this correctly, the Freedom Convoy, which, I'll let you tell me about this, but effectively the Canadian truckers self-organized this protest against government mandates, and it seems to have become a very large event. I'm kind of just watching from the sidelines here through media, but I'd love for you to tell me a bit about the movement and what impact it's having.
So it all started when, let me step back. There's been a lot of frustration with the endless series of mandates and restrictions that have continued ever since March of 2020. And the Canadian people are very deferential. If the government tells Canadians that they have to do something for the collective health of the nation, most people say, hey, you know what, let's do it. And they did. But it just never seemed to end. And increasingly of late, governments have been doing things that don't feel like they have a lot of scientific rationale. And the most obvious one was they said truckers who are doing international shipments, that is across the Canada-US border, have to show a vaccine passport. And you got to think, okay, the trucker is sitting alone in his truck. He's not even interacting with other people other than for a quick stop at the gas station for a cup of coffee occasionally, but you have very little interaction. So even on the basis of the argument that we needed to reduce transmission, it didn't seem to make a lot of sense. So a lot of truckers began a protest that led to a convoy driving across the country, and they've come from all over Canada. And they've been greeted by Canadians at overpasses in small towns everywhere as with a great deal of support. People are waving flags. There are sometimes 500-600 people at an overpass waving them by. The convoy had thousands of trucks, and it just grew as they traveled from Western Canada towards the nation's capital and from the east as well. And now they are converged on Parliament Hill, where they've parked their trucks. And they're basically saying it's time to end the mandates and the restrictions and give Canadians their freedoms back.
Beautiful. Well, we need more of that in the world, especially after the past 24 months. I did hear that maybe they raised some money for that, and perhaps some of it was seized, and then they started raising some money in Bitcoin instead. Was that, how did that work?
I don't know anything about that. I did hear that GoFundMe was not handing over their donations at first, but I really don't have any knowledge about how that all transpired. I'm not personally involved with the organization of it. I'm just giving my support to individual truckers who are standing up for their freedoms and livelihoods.
That's great. Yeah, and I've noticed something else on your Twitter. You've been very outspoken on this issue of COVID being used as a never-ending excuse for power-hungry authorities to replace individual freedom with state control, as you write. I'm paraphrasing there, not an exact quote. So, and you tweeted recently, I've noticed you're retweeting this particular tweet about different instances of that. And
Mm-hmm.
one of these retweets was the Federal Health Agency tracked 33 million cell phones during COVID and is planning to track population movements for roughly the next 5 years. Whoa, what in the world is going on here? And maybe you could tell me a little bit about that and other instances of this never-ending excuse being used.
Yeah, this story broke about a month ago now. The government was tracking cell phone traffic. Now, they claimed that the reason was that that it would help them better understand population movements and therefore the transmission of the virus. But it was revealed they want to keep doing this for another 5 years, and nobody has told us that the government expects the COVID crisis to go on for another half decade. Which really raises the question of why then would they want to track the population for that length of time? And, you look at that example, the first thing Trudeau did when COVID hit was he put forward a bill ostensibly to provide COVID aid to people in need, but it contained a provision allowing him to raise any tax to any level for any reason for 2 years without parliamentary sign-off. That is unprecedented in our parliamentary tradition. I've never heard of it anywhere in 800 years. And of course, there's just they put forward a bill to censor what you can see and say online, ostensibly to promote Canadian content. So you have these bureaucrats in Ottawa protecting Canadiana. We don't want anybody in Canada hearing from Robert Breedlove. He's not sufficiently Canadian in his outlook. He hasn't eaten a beaver tail in the Byward Market, and he doesn't skate down the canal. So I guess his content would not be considered Canadian enough, and they wanted to censor what Canadians could see in order to keep out what they consider to be outside voices. And the bill actually got defeated, but everyone from traditionally left of center artists and academics and library associations actually had to rise up and oppose this thing because it was so bloody Orwellian. Right. But these are examples, Robert, of the power grabs that we've seen again and again since COVID, always with some altruistic justification, but never an authentic one.
Yes, there always seems to be some type of moral camouflage put on these different political actions that in almost every instance that I've seen is divergent from what its true intention appears to be.
Absolutely.
And one of the things, I think it was Trudeau that said this, something about unacceptable views recently had some quote. I mean, we've gone so far awry in the past 24 months, and this all seems very unprecedented to me. I've never experienced anything like this. In my study of history, I've seen it a lot. How are you experiencing this? Where are we? What's going on? It seems like history's taken a lot of zigs and zags. Where are we today, and where do we go from here?
I think that some governments are trying to instill constant fear in order to sustain their exceptional powers. They are trying to make Canadians, or around the world and other places too, I suspect it's true, but trying to make citizens fear each other in order to justify permanent government overreach. And so I think governments that want to take away liberty always have to make people afraid. And that's certainly what our government is doing. They're constantly heaping fear and doom on the population. Doom about all of the scary people that you have to worry about that live in your country and are on the internet. Doom about how dangerous life has become, and doom that always has as its solution more governmental control over what people see and say and how they spend their money and so on and so forth. So I think what people need to do is reassert their self-confidence and insist on reclaiming the ancient liberties that have survived many crises. You know, like what blew me away is they tried to shut down our parliament. I think Trudeau wanted it to be shut down for a very long time when COVID started. When the Nazis were bombing London, the British Parliament kept meeting. They would meet in cathedrals and in other places to avoid danger, but they would still meet. And that was probably the greatest crisis in modern British history. But Churchill was still determined to go in and be accountable to the British people for because he understood that that was the very democracy he was defending in the war. And so, yes, if they were able to do that during the war, they were able to keep freedom of expression alive, then surely we can do that here in Canada during a viral pandemic.
Well said. Pierre, look, I'm really grateful to have you on this side of the fight for freedom. I think it's more important than ever. And thank you for being a voice of reason and sanity in this increasingly crazy world of ours. I'm sure my audience knows where to find you, but in case they don't, could you please let us know where they can find out more about you or your work?
Yeah, click withpierre.ca, withpierre.ca, and check out my website. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube as well. So join me on any of those platforms. Love to stay in touch and continue the conversation.
Thank you, Pierre. This has been great.